Hey guys, tonight we begin with humanity's oldest friend and worst decision, alcohol. From ancient temples to medieval taverns, we've been finding creative ways to ruin mornings since civilization began. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before civilization, before writing, before anyone figured out how to boil water without burning down the hut, someone accidentally invented getting drunk. It happened around 7000 BC. In Neolithic China, when a farmer left a pot filled with rice, honey, and fruit sitting around too long, the mixture fermented, as all neglected things do, and created a mysterious bubbling potion that smelled like both curiosity and regret. At some point, a human, possibly hungry, possibly stupid, definitely bored, decided to drink it. That moment right, there was the dawn of human history. Not the invention of the wheel, not the discovery of fire, but the instant someone looked at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and said, "Yeah, I'll risk it." The first sip was confusing. The second felt amazing. By the third, our prehistoric hero was trying to explain emotions to a goat. The world spun, trees started looking philosophical, and everyone suddenly seemed like a really good dancer. It must have felt like touching the divine, which is probably what they told their friends before collapsing into a pile of mud. Congratulations, humanity! You've just discovered alcohol, and 5 hours later, the concept of consequences. Archaeologists later found 9000 old pottery jars at the site of Jahu, still stained with traces of that ancient brew, a blend of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. It's the earliest known cocktail, the prehistoric equivalent of whatever's in the fridge. Chemical analysis confirmed it was fermented, which means this wasn't an accident anymore. It was the beginning of a tradition. Someone got drunk, survived it, and decided to do it again on purpose. And thus the world's first hangover arrived. The next morning, our ancient innovator woke up in a puddle of their own choices, dehydrated, dizzy, and inventing the first known excuse. "It must have been something I ate. This wasn't just a drink. It was humanity's first coping mechanism, a portable vacation from reality, long before there were jobs, taxes, or neighbors to blame." So yes, while later civilizations would build pyramids, write laws, and split atoms, this is where it truly began. One forgotten jar, one bad decision, and one species realizing that sometimes oblivion tastes pretty good. If you ever needed proof that humans have their priorities backward, look no further than Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BC, while the rest of nature was evolving for survival, humanity invented beer, and only afterward thought, you know what might go well with this. Food. Yes, beer came before bread. People were brewing barley long before they figured out how to bake it. Archaeologists found ancient tablets showing Sumerians joyfully drinking from large communal pots through straws, because even then, nobody wanted to share germs. These weren't small cups either. Imagine a group of adults hunched over what looks like a muddy punch bowl, sipping in silence and pretending it's a spiritual experience. That was civilization's first happy hour. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer. They built an entire belief system around it. They had a goddess of brewing named Ningi because of course they did. Her hymn, yes, there's a hymn, doubles as a recipe for beer. It's probably the oldest surviving homebrew guide on Earth. Modern civilization began not with philosophy, but with a tipsy choir praising a divine bartender. Beer wasn't a luxury. It was essential infrastructure. Water in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't exactly safe. It was more of a health gamble, but beer, brewed and fermented, was purified by boiling and alcohol content. In other words, drinking beer wasn't irresponsible. It was the healthiest choice available. Imagine explaining that to your doctor today. Daily rations included beer for everyone, workers, priests, even children. And it wasn't the fizzy golden stuff we know now. It was thick, sweet, and full of floating barley bits. Archaeologists describe it as nutrient-rich. Modern translation, drinkable oatmeal with a buzz. And yet, somehow, this murky brew fueled the world's first cities. People farmed, built temples, and wrote ununiform tablets, all while maintaining a steady state of mild intoxication. Which explains why half of early Sumerian laws sound like they were written at closing time. So yes, beer built civilization. Not logic, not language, not ambition. Just a group of dehydrated farmers solving the world's problems. One foamy bowl at a time. If Mesopotamia invented beer, Egypt turned it into a lifestyle. By 3000 B.C., the Nile Valley had mastered the art of getting tipsy before lunch. Beer wasn't a treat. It was daily nutrition. It appeared at breakfast, prayer, wages, and funerals. Technically, you could live your entire life fueled by bread, onions, and beer, which explains why most ancient Egyptians looked both busy and perpetually tired. For the common people, beer was cheap and thick, more of a liquid porridge than a drink. It was brewed from barley and emma wheat, sweetened with dates, and poured into clay jugs that probably hadn't been cleaned since the reign of the last guy. Still, it was safer than Nile water, which came with bonus parasites. The average peasant drank 2 to 3 L a day, which means half of Egyptian civilization was built by people who were quietly buzzed. Even children drank it, not because ancient Egypt was wild, but because sober hydration wasn't an option. When the water gives you dysentery, beer for breakfast starts to sound perfectly reasonable. Parents would fill clay cups for their kids and send them off to school like it was orange juice. And we wonder why math was invented elsewhere. The upper class, meanwhile, preferred wine, the official beverage of people who didn't do manual labor. Pharaohs imported it from Syria and Greece, stored it in ornate jars, and pretended it was a symbol of refinement instead of grape juice gone rogue. Cleopatra herself supposedly had her own vineyard because ruling Egypt apparently required both charm and Cabernet. Temples brewed on an industrial scale. Workers who built the pyramids were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, meaning the most iconic monument on earth was fueled by carbohydrates and mild inebriation. The afterlife even came stocked with it. Tomb paintings show servants pouring beer for the dead, ensuring eternal refreshment and presumably eternal hangovers. So, while Egypt gave us papyrus geometry and divine kingship, it also gave us something more relatable. The eternal truth that life is easier to endure when it's slightly blurry around the edges. While the Egyptians were drinking bread soup and calling it beer, the Chinese were doing something far more refined, or at least pretending to. Around 3000 B.C., early brewers in the Yellow River Valley began fermenting rice, millet, and fruit into beverages that actually tasted intentional. Archaeologists have found ornate bronze vessels coated in residue that once held early Chinese wine, proof that humanity's talent for turning dinner into liquid regret was now a global phenomenon. Unlike other cultures that stumbled into intoxication, the Chinese organized it. Fermentation wasn't a happy accident. It was chemistry with religious backing. Alcohol was considered a gift from the heavens, a bridge between mortals and their ancestors, which is poetic until you remember that this bridge usually ended with someone singing off-key before passing out in a rice field. Drinking became central to ritual life. Kings and nobles hosted elaborate ceremonies where wine was offered to the spirits, and then immediately to themselves, just to make sure it was safe. Ancient texts mention officials who lost their positions for being too sober at court banquets. In other words, abstaining wasn't just uncool. It was politically risky. The Chinese didn't brew casually, they engineered it. They refined fermentation vessels, standardized recipes, and even documented alcohol etiquette. By the Shang dynasty around 1600 BCE, court life was one long, well-funded tasting session. There were official drinking songs, drinking cups shaped like animals, and inevitably the first government warnings about excess. Because even the world's oldest bureaucracy realized that productivity plummets when half your ministers are horizontal. Still, alcohol was seen as sacred, the water of life, as early poets called it. It inspired calligraphy, music, and the kind of philosophy that only makes sense until you reread it sober. Even Confucius, the future champion of discipline, warned against drunkenness with the kind of weary tone that suggests personal experience. So, while other civilizations were still figuring out how to keep their beer from exploding, the Chinese were already holding formal banquets, toasting their ancestors, and probably forgetting half their toasts by dessert. Civilization, it seems, doesn't truly begin until someone's offering spiritual enlightenment with a side of fermented fruit. If there's one thing that unites all early civilizations, it's their determination to make sure someone was drinking during the invention of writing. In Mesopotamia around 2700 BC, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a plot device. The world's oldest known story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like an ancient cautionary tale about friendship, mortality, and drinking outside your comfort zone. The story introduces Enkidu, a wild man who lives among animals until a woman lures him into civilization with two very convincing arguments: bread and beer. After his first drink, Enkidu became human, which is a polite way of saying he discovered the magic of lowered standards. The Sumerians didn't believe alcohol corrupted man. They believed it completed him. Somewhere, a modern philosopher is still trying to argue that point with less evidence. In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just social, it was spiritual. Temples doubled as breweries, priests moonlighted as bartenders, and offerings to the gods often included a fresh pint. Archaeologists have found clay tablets featuring ancient recipes, literal hymns to Ning Kari, the goddess of beer. They read less like scripture and more like a medieval pub song. Praise the brew, stir the mash, and may your liver hold out another year. Beer was considered liquid bread, a phrase that made fasting sound virtuous and happy hour sound holy. It was also practical, a way to preserve grain without it rotting. Workers building temples and canals received daily beer rations as wages. Somewhere between the fifth and sixth sip, civilization started to make sense, writing contracts, dividing labor, and occasionally passing out beside the ziggurat. The result: history's first bureaucracy fueled by barley. Accountants recorded beer rations, priests blessed the barrels, and poets immortalized the feeling of a good buzz. Ancient tablets even include complaints from workers about receiving weak beer. That's right. The world's first customer service feedback was a 4,000-year-old Yelp review about watered-down ale. So while philosophers would later debate the meaning of life, Mesopotamia had already found it at the bottom of a communal beer pot. Humanity's first epic didn't just celebrate heroism. It celebrated the universal truth that no great story ever started with a salad. If Mesopotamia drank for civilization and Egypt drank for religion, the Greeks drank for conversation, and sometimes to forget the conversation they just had. By 600 B.C., Greece had elevated alcohol from mere refreshment to a full-blown social institution. The symposium, a word that literally means drinking together, which to be fair is still a cornerstone of Western philosophy. A symposium wasn't a tavern or a frat party, though the line was thin. It was a structured drinking event with rules, music, poetry, and at least one person pretending to be profound. The guests reclined on couches, servants poured wine, and everyone discussed ethics until ethics stopped mattering. They even appointed a symposia, the designated adult whose job was to water down the wine. Because Greek wine was so strong it could make a Spartan hug someone. And yes, they always watered it down. Mixing wine with water was the mark of civilization. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something Thrians did before invading your city. The Greeks genuinely believed that moderation separated man from beast, which is ironic considering the average symposium ended with someone crying, singing, or waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods, of course, had their own drinking scene. Dionysus, god of wine and chaos, was the divine patron of both theater and hangovers. His followers roamed the countryside, dancing, shouting, and making modern music festivals look like knitting clubs. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't just indulgence. It was temporary madness blessed by heaven. Philosophers weren't immune either. Plato, in his Dialogue Symposium, used drinking as a metaphor for love and divine truth, because apparently nothing says eternal wisdom like slurred metaphysics. One can imagine Socrates cup in hand, insisting that virtue is knowledge while everyone else debated whose cup that was. The Greeks did, however, give the world its first recorded hangover cure, eating cabbage before drinking. It didn't work, but it did confirm humanity's eternal optimism in the face of bad decisions. So, yes, the Greeks mixed logic with wine, reason with chaos, and gave birth to Western philosophy between refills. Civilization had discovered something crucial. Deep thought is always easier when you can blame it on the alcohol. Every civilization has its party god, but the Greeks outdid everyone with Dionysus, the divine embodiment of wine, ecstasy, and poor impulse control. While other deities handed down moral codes or laws, Dionysus showed up barefoot with a bottle and said, "Let's feel something." His cult spread like spilled wine across the Mediterranean. Followers, mostly women called Maenads, abandoned their homes to join wild processions into the mountains. There, under the influence of fermented grape juice and divine enthusiasm, they sang, danced, and occasionally tore apart small animals, the ancient equivalent of festival chaos. But make it religious to outsiders, this looked insane. To believers, it was transcendence. The Greeks saw drunkenness not as sin, but as a divine state, temporary madness that stripped away logic and let mortals glimpse the gods. In short, Dionysus was history's first spiritual excuse for bad decisions. His festivals, the Dionysia, were wild, joyful, and mandatory. They started as wine-soaked parades and ended up inventing theater. Yes, Western drama literally began as a drinking festival. Tragedy and comedy were born in the same place. Someone once shouted, "Who drank all the afore?" Actors wore masks, choruses sang hymns, and playwrights competed for prizes, all while the audience maintained a polite level of intoxication that modern critics would call immersive participation. But Dionysus wasn't all party. His myths warned that rejecting joy was dangerous. King Pentheus tried to ban his cult, calling it indecent, which ended poorly when the Maenads, in a frenzy, mistook him for a lion and solved the problem violently. Moral of the story: never get between a Greek and their weekend plans. For the philosophers, Dionysus represented the chaos inside the human soul, the opposite of Apollo, god of order. Together, they symbolize the eternal tension between reason and instinct. Or to put it less academically, the voice that says be responsible and the other that says one more won't hurt. In Dionysus, the Greeks found both creation and destruction, the bliss of losing control and the hangover that follows enlightenment. Civilization needed both gods. After all, without Apollo, we'd have no structure. Without Dionysus, we'd have no stories worth telling. When it came to alcohol, the Romans didn't just drink, they industrialized it. If the Greeks drank for philosophy, the Romans drank for everything else: politics, religion, hygiene, and boredom. They had a saying in veneno veritas, in wine there is truth, which probably explains why so many Roman truths ended with bad decisions and new emperors. Wine was the fuel of the empire. It flowed through aqueducts of social life from the slums to the Senate. Everyone drank it: soldiers, farmers, slaves, emperors, even the gods in myth. It was so essential that soldiers received daily wine rations instead of water, which raises a few questions about Roman military strategy. Marching hundreds of miles through Gaul while mildly buzzed. Bold move, Caesar. Roman vineyards stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They cultivated hundreds of varieties, none of which were aged, filtered, or remotely pleasant. Ancient wine was syrupy, acidic, and often mixed with honey, herbs, seawater, or anything that might distract from the taste. Think less fine vintage, more liquid dare. At feasts, guests reclined on couches surrounded by silver cups and regret. Servants poured endlessly while musicians played, and philosophers shouted half-coherent Latin about virtue. Drinking wasn't about taste, it was about status. The richer the Roman, the more bizarre the ingredients. Caligula supposedly mixed pearls into his wine to prove his wealth, or perhaps to explain why everyone looked terrified at dinner. Of course, there were attempts at moderation. The Stoics warned against excess, claiming self-control was the path to wisdom. But the Stoics were also the same people who lived under Nero, so one can forgive them for occasionally breaking their own rules. Public drunkenness wasn't condemned. It was expected. Poets wrote verses about hangovers, and even the gods drank heavily. Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, had his own festivals so chaotic that the Senate eventually banned them. Naturally, that made them twice as popular. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and empires, but its true legacy might be social drinking. When the empire finally fell, it wasn't just to barbarians or politics. It was at least partly to the eternal Roman habit of raising a glass and saying, "We'll deal with it tomorrow." While the Greeks philosophized over wine and the Romans drowned in it, the Persians turned drinking into literature. They treated wine the way most people treat religion, with devotion, ritual, and the occasional public scandal. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, kings hosted banquets that could feed a small city. Herodotus claimed guests were expected to get drunk and then make important decisions, because, according to Persian logic, a plan tested while sober and intoxicated had double the integrity. A system that probably worked until someone suggested invading Greece after dessert. But the real poetry of wine came centuries later under the Islamic Golden Age, when alcohol became a theological controversy with a side of irony. The Quran banned it, yet Persian poets couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden nectar, the ruby of the soul, liquid wisdom. Basically, the world's first creative loophole. No one mastered the art of poetic intoxication quite like Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and wine enthusiast who turned hangovers into hakus. His Rubaiyat reads like a soft rebellion, verses dripping with nostalgia, philosophy, and subtle blasphemy. "A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou," he wrote, which is ancient Persian for date night under house arrest. In truth, Persian society had a complex relationship with the bottle. Publicly, wine was sinful. Privately, it was practically an art form. Aristocrats drank in lush gardens surrounded by fountains, poetry, and plausible deniability. They toasted to love, beauty, and occasionally the hypocrisy of their own laws. It was the kind of cultural tension only a civilization, both brilliant and deeply self-aware, could sustain. Persian physicians even prescribed wine for health, diluted, of course, to strengthen the spirit and improve digestion. So yes, even medieval doctors were giving out excuses. By the time travelers from Europe arrived, they were shocked to find that Persians, officially dry, were quietly running some of the most refined wineries in the world. The Persian relationship with alcohol was a balancing act. One hand writing scripture, the other uncorking metaphor. They didn't just drink to forget, they drank to remember beautifully. While Rome sipped its spiced wine and recited poetry about empire, the so-called barbarians of northern Europe were doing something far more efficient, getting unapologetically drunk. The Celts, Germans, and Norse didn't care about etiquette, philosophy, or proper dilution ratios. They cared about results, namely forgetting winter and improving their confidence in battle. The Greeks called them barbarians because they didn't mix their wine with water. The barbarians called the Greeks boring. Their preferred brews were me and ale, both of which came in quantities that could drown a small child. Mead, fermented honey and water, was the drink of heroes, kings, and anyone who could stand upright long enough to refill their horn. The Vikings believed me came from the gods themselves, specifically from a mythical vat filled with honey and poetry. The fact that this beverage inspired both war songs and spontaneous axe-throwing contests says a lot about its effectiveness. The Celts had their own beer brewed in clay pots and flavored with herbs instead of hops. They drank it from communal bowls, shouting toasts that probably sounded inspiring at the time and incoherent the next morning. In Celtic culture, hospitality meant refilling your guest's cup until they achieved spiritual enlightenment or passed out. Meanwhile, the Germans developed ale so strong that even Roman diplomats mentioned it with caution. When Tacitus wrote about German tribes, he described them as fierce, brave, and fond of drunken councils, which is ancient Latin, for they keep making military plans they can't remember. But drinking wasn't just recreation. It was ritual. To the northern tribes, alcohol connected them to their ancestors and gods. Warriors drank before raids to gain courage and after battle to forget what they'd done with it. Mead was sacred at funerals, weddings, and every occasion that could be made slightly louder. When Rome finally fell, it wasn't the barbarians drinking that shocked them. It was the realization that these univilized people had been celebrating life the whole time. Where Rome had laws, they had toasts. Where Rome had rhetoric, they had rhythm. In the end, the so-called barbarians didn't just conquer the empire, they out-drank it. And that, in its own way, might be history's most intoxicating victory. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it left behind three things: bad roads, suspicious water, and an enormous collective hangover. Into that chaos stepped a new kind of hero, the monk. They didn't wear armor, wield swords, or chase glory. They brewed beer, yes, while barbarians were busy inventing kingdoms and plundering libraries. Monks quietly perfected the art of fermentation. In cold, drafty monasteries from France to Bavaria, they discovered that beer could be more than survival fluid. It could be holy hydration. During fasting, when food was forbidden, but liquids were allowed, monks brewed a thick, nourishing beer they nicknamed liquid bread. It was practical theology. Obey God, stay hydrated, and feel pleasantly detached from earthly suffering. Medieval monastic beer wasn't the light golden brew we know today. It was dense, cloudy, and packed with calories. More a meal you could pour than a drink you could chug. Monks refined recipes, experimented with yeasts, and standardized brewing temperatures centuries before craft beer became a personality trait. Some even kept brewing logs more detailed than royal chronicles because priorities. Every monastery had its own style. The Benedictines favored malteedness. The Cistercians aimed for purity, and the Trappists perfected patience. The virtue most useful when your entire existence revolves around waiting for fermentation. Beer wasn't just sustenance. It was an economic engine. Monks sold it to pilgrims, travelers, and anyone desperate to forget feudalism for an evening. The church tolerated this because, frankly, it worked. Beer was safer than water, and kept the populace content. A mildly intoxicated peasantry was a peaceful one. And since monasteries controlled production, holiness stayed comfortably profitable. Some historians credit these monks with saving beer itself. Without their careful record-keeping, brewing might have vanished alongside Roman plumbing and dental hygiene. Instead, they turned it into a science. Today, when you crack open a Belgian ale, you're tasting the legacy of men who took vows of silence and then invented a drink that made silence enjoyable. So, while knights won glory and kings claimed crowns, monks won something more enduring: the eternal gratitude of anyone who's ever needed to make medieval life a little more bearable. While monks were brewing salvation one barrel at a time, everyone else in medieval Europe was simply trying to stay cheerful, or at least hydrated. Enter me, the golden honey-based ancestor of all comfort drinks. Before hops became fashionable, me was the sweet sticky drink of choice for kings, peasants, and anyone who needed to forget the weather for a few hours. Mead had ancient roots, but found its true calling in the Dark Ages, when it shone like liquid sunlight in a world of mud and superstition. It was easy to make, just honey, water, and a bit of reckless optimism. Fermentation did the rest. In northern Europe, where grapes refused to grow and barley froze half the year, mead became the closest thing to happiness in a cup. The Norsemen treated it as divine. According to legend, the gods themselves drank from the me of poetry, a celestial brew that granted wisdom, eloquence, and occasionally terrible singing. Viking skalds composed verses about it, which might explain why half their poetry reads like a drunk text carved into stone. A proper Viking feast wasn't measured by food, but by how many horns of meat you could survive before declaring eternal brotherhood with the furniture. Further south, mead became the wedding drink of choice. Newlyweds were given enough honey wine to last a moon cycle, hence the term honeymoon, a romantic tradition that originally involved two people and one very long hangover. Peasants, meanwhile, made simpler versions with whatever honey they could find, sometimes spiced with herbs, sometimes with bugs. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. After a day of field labor, a warm mug of me could turn even feudalism into mild comedy. Monks brewed it too, because monks brewed everything. They used me in medicine, in cooking, and presumably in diplomacy. It was sweet, shelf-stable, and easier to bless than wine. By the 13th century, me began losing ground to beer and wine, but it never quite disappeared. It lingered, the quiet golden ghost of Europe's drinking past, a drink born of bees and boredom, reminding everyone that sometimes history doesn't advance. It just refills the cup. As medieval Europe perfected the art of drinking responsibly never, the Islamic world was moving in the opposite direction, at least on paper. When Islam spread across the Middle East in the 7th century, it brought a clear message: alcohol was haram, forbidden. In theory, that should have ended centuries of intoxication. In practice, it turned drinking into one of history's longest running winks. Before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula already knew its liquors. The Bedouins brewed date wine. Persians loved their poetry and pomegranate cocktails, and everyone agreed that hangovers were universal. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, who outlawed alcohol, not out of spite but survival. Drunken camel races were ending poorly, and someone had to be the adult in the room. The early caliphs enforced sobriety with admirable effort, but the empire grew faster than its rules. From Spain to Persia, local customs proved resilient. Court poets kept writing suspiciously passionate odes to wine, which they insisted was a metaphor for divine love. Of course, that divine love also made you hiccup, sing, and confess things to total strangers. Nowhere was the contradiction more delicious than in Baghdad. By the 9th century, it was the center of art, science, and polite disobedience. The Abbasid caliphs officially banned wine but kept private gardens where fountains didn't always flow with water. The poet Abu Nuwas, Baghdad's most charming menace, filled entire volumes with verses about drinking under moonlight. Lines so beautiful that religious scholars spent centuries arguing whether he was being spiritual or sarcastic. Meanwhile, physicians prescribed wine for digestive harmony. Sufis used intoxication as a metaphor for mystical union, and merchants quietly traded grapes behind mosques. The official stance was sobriety. The unofficial one was curiosity. By the 12th century, Islamic chemists had even refined distillation, producing early forms of spirits, though they mostly called it medicine to avoid awkward questions. Ironically, the word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, alol meaning the essence. The language that banned it also gave it a name. So yes, the Islamic world went dry officially. Unofficially, it just learned to pour its rebellion into verse. By the 13th century, Europe had finally sobered up just enough to invent the tavern, a public house where everyone could drink together, argue about taxes, and forget they were peasants for a few glorious hours. It was democracy before democracy, only louder and slightly stickier. Taverns became the social engine of medieval life. Lords had castles, priests had cathedrals, but ordinary people had the pub. You didn't need wealth or pedigree to enter, just a thirst and enough coins to make it past the door. Inside, the floor was straw, the air was smoke, and the rules were simple. Drink, sing, and pretend your problems were the king's fault. They popped up everywhere along trade routes, near markets, beside churches, because convenience matters. For travelers, taverns were lifesavers. For locals, they were therapy with a handle. It was the one place where a blacksmith could debate theology with a monk. A farmer could complain about rent to a knight, and everyone could agree the ale tasted better last week. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, ran many of these establishments. They were entrepreneurial, fierce, and often accused of witchcraft, mostly because their success made men uncomfortable. Their trade signs, broomsticks, cats, and cauldrons, later inspired much of the witch imagery we know today. So, yes, medieval feminism smelled faintly of hops. Taverns also became the birthplace of politics. Revolution doesn't start in palaces. It starts wherever someone's shouting, "You know what we should do," over a third mug of ale. From the peasant uprisings of England to the conspiracies that shaped Renaissance Italy, history's boldest ideas often began in places with questionable sanitation. Authorities hated taverns for exactly that reason. Kings feared sedition, priests feared sin, and innkeepers feared running out of beer. Still, taverns survived every crackdown because shutting down drinking in the Middle Ages was like banning rain. It just moved locations. By the end of the 15th century, taverns weren't just hangouts. They were culture. They gave Europe its gossip, its folk songs, its revolutions, and perhaps most importantly, its first public bathrooms of sorts. Civilization had finally created a place where everyone could gather, disagree, and stumble home together. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had spent the better part of a millennium drinking its way through disease, famine, and theology. When the Renaissance arrived, everyone simply traded me for wine and called it progress. The new age of reason was, ironically, soaked in alcohol. Scholars debated astronomy, anatomy, and metaphysics, usually over a jug of something fermented. Da Vinci drank in moderation. Michelangelo preferred wine to water, and Erasmus joked that no one could think clearly on an empty stomach or a dry throat. Civilization was sobering up intellectually, not physically. The printing press spread knowledge, but taverns spread opinions faster. Coffee houses hadn't arrived yet, so beer remained Europe's unofficial Wi-Fi. It connected merchants, artists, sailors, and anyone who could still afford a cup. New beverages were appearing, too. Distilled spirits from alchemists' labs, sweet wines from the Mediterranean, and early tonics that claimed to cure everything except hangovers. The age of exploration also became the age of exporting alcoholism. European ships carried wine, rum, and brandy to every corner of the known world, ensuring that no civilization would ever again suffer the tragedy of sobriety. Colonial merchants made fortunes on sugar and spirits, and sailors drank enough rum to keep scurvy away, or at least not care about it. At home, drinking became social performance. Royal banquets featured fountains that flowed with wine, because nothing says divine right like sticky floors. Henry Roman VIII brewed his own ale, proving you can dismantle a church and still be very committed to home brewing. Meanwhile, peasants continued their eternal tradition, drinking the same weak ale and pretending not to notice that nothing had changed. By the 17th century, Europe stood on the edge of modernity with printing, science, and political reform, but still firmly clutching its mug. The church had doctrines, the universities had logic, and the taverns had better attendance. It's tempting to think of alcohol as a side note to history, but it's closer to the soundtrack. From ancient rice brews to Renaissance vineyards, the story of civilization isn't just about invention. It's about endurance, and humanity, ever resourceful, found that a little fermentation made endurance taste a lot better. The year was 41 B.C. Rome stood fractured, its triumvirs uneasy allies after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony, the brilliant but impulsive general, had been sent east to restore order and secure loyalty among Rome's provinces. Yet beyond politics awaited a woman who could alter the course of empires, Cleopatra Iith, Queen of Egypt. Antony summoned her to the city of Tarsus to answer charges that she had aided Caesar's enemies. It was a power play, Rome reminding Egypt, who ruled the Mediterranean. But Cleopatra had no intention of appearing as a supplicant. Instead, she arrived as a goddess. Her barge sailed up the Cydnus River, draped in purple sails that caught the sun like molten gold. Perfume wafted across the water, and musicians played as attendants fanned her throne. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Isis incarnate, the goddess of fertility and power. When Antony finally laid eyes on her, the balance of power shifted. He had faced legions, conspiracies, and kings, but never a woman who could command silence with a glance. Cleopatra understood performance better than any ruler of her age. She knew that perception was power, and she crafted her entrance as carefully as Rome forged its swords. Antony, both soldier and sensualist, found himself enthralled. The two dined together that night in a spectacle that outshone any Roman triumph. Banquets of roasted peacocks, jeweled goblets brimming with wine, and laughter that lingered until dawn. Yet beneath the silk and gold was strategy. Cleopatra's throne was precarious. Egypt depended on Rome's favor for survival. Aligning with Antony could secure her kingdom's future, and her son Caesarion's claim as the heir of Julius Caesar. Antony, meanwhile, saw in her not only a lover, but an ally of immense wealth and mystique. Egypt's riches could fuel his ambitions against his rival Octavian back in Rome. That night, two worlds collided: the disciplined steel of Roman authority and the perfumed splendor of Egyptian divinity. Their meeting was more than passion. It was politics wrapped in seduction, empire disguised as romance. And from that first encounter, neither would ever rule or love the same way again. In the weeks that followed, Mark Antony remained in Cleopatra's orbit, first as a guest, then as something far more intimate. Their alliance grew not merely from desire, but from shared ambition. Antony saw in Cleopatra the embodiment of everything Rome had lost: grandeur without restraint, wealth without guilt, beauty entwined with power. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in him the instrument of her political survival, a man who could restore Egypt's influence in the Mediterranean and secure her son's future. Antony was captivated by the queen's intellect as much as her allure. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages, quick with wit, and utterly fearless in debate. She could discuss philosophy with the same ease that she ordered fleets into the Nile. Unlike Roman women who were bound by decorum, Cleopatra ruled with unashamed sovereignty. To Antony, who had spent years under the shadow of Caesar and the scrutiny of Rome's Senate, her presence was intoxicating. She offered him what the Republic never could, freedom from politics disguised as duty. Their days were spent in lavish feasts, philosophical conversations, and carefully staged games. Together they formed the inimitable Livers, a private society devoted to excess, luxury, and laughter. They disguised themselves at night, wandering Alexandria's streets in playful anonymity, drinking with sailors, mocking magistrates, and living like mortals instead of monarchs. The city adored them. Cleopatra's charisma turned every appearance into theater, and Antony's rough charm complemented her perfectly. But while they reveled, the world beyond their golden walls was changing. In Rome, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, watched Antony's behavior with growing suspicion. Every rumor of debauchery, every tale of Egyptian splendor reached his ears and stoked his resentment. To Octavian, Antony was no longer a Roman hero, but a man seduced by an Eastern temptress, one who threatened the unity of the Republic itself. Still, Antony dismissed such whispers as envy. He believed his military prowess, and his name could withstand any scandal. Cleopatra encouraged his confidence, gifting him ships, silver, and soldiers to secure his campaigns. Together they forged not only a romance, but a partnership meant to rival Rome's might. In Alexandria they were king and queen of pleasure and power alike. Two rulers in love, defying the empire that sought to divide them. But Rome, jealous and unrelenting, was already sharpening its knives. By the time Antony returned to Alexandria in 37 B.C., his bond with Cleopatra had evolved from indulgence to calculated alliance. The queen had proven herself indispensable. Egypt's treasury overflowed with grain, gold, and the fabled Nile wealth that Rome's legions could never fully plunder. For Antony, who dreamed of surpassing Caesar's glory and ruling the Eastern world, Cleopatra was both muse and means. She welcomed him with the splendor of a pharaoh. Banquets glittered beneath ceilings of silver stars, and dancers reenacted the divine union of Isis and Osiris, symbolizing their own partnership. Cleopatra presented Antony with gifts not of love, but of empire. Ships for his campaigns, soldiers trained in Egyptian archery, and the loyalty of the eastern provinces. In return, Antony granted her territories, Cyprus, Crete, parts of Syria and Sicya, restoring much of Egypt's former Ptolemaic domain. It was a gesture that infuriated Rome, which saw its general carving away pieces of the Republic for a foreign queen. To their followers, however, Antony and Cleopatra appeared as divine counterparts, he as the new Dionysus, god of wine and conquest, she as Isis, the mother of kings. Together they styled themselves rulers of the East, openly embracing the grandeur of monarchy that Rome pretended to despise but secretly envied. Antony's Roman discipline softened. He dressed in Eastern robes, adopted Egyptian rituals, and held court in the lavish palace overlooking the Nile. Cleopatra bore him twins, a boy and a girl named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, symbols of their union's divine legitimacy. Their births were celebrated as omens of a new dynasty that would unite East and West. Cleopatra saw in her children not just heirs, but living proof that her bloodline could outlast Rome's. Yet not everyone rejoiced. In the marble halls of the Senate, whispers turned to outrage. Antony's distribution of kingdoms to Cleopatra's children, the so-called donations of Alexandria, was viewed as treason. To the Romans, he was no longer a protector of their interests, but a man bewitched, handing the world's riches to an Egyptian seductress. In their palace, the lovers toasted to eternity beneath the fragrance of lotus and myrrh. But beyond the Nile, storm clouds gathered. Octavian's propaganda began to paint them as enemies of Roman virtue, a decadent queen and a fallen hero, daring to dream of empire in defiance of the Republic. As the years passed, Antony and Cleopatra built a world that seemed to float between myth and power, a realm of pleasure gilded by ambition. Alexandria became the beating heart of their empire, where politics was conducted in marble halls, perfumed with incense, and feasts became councils of strategy. The queen's court shimmered with philosophers, engineers, and poets, each serving her vision of an Egypt reborn under divine rule. Antony, the hardened general who once commanded Rome's armies, found himself transformed. No longer bound by the Senate's scorn, he reveled in the Egyptian ideal of kingship, a god among men. He trained his legions by day and feasted by night, hosting spectacles that blurred the line between politics and performance. Cleopatra joined him in armor on parade, presenting herself as Isis beside her consort, Dionysus. Together they appeared before the crowds on golden thrones, uniting Roman strength and Egyptian divinity in a single image of unchallengeable majesty. Yet behind the music and the opulence, their empire teetered on peril. Antony's campaigns against Parthia, the eastern rival of Rome, ended in humiliation. The desert devoured his army, his legions starving and frostbitten, retreating through mountains littered with corpses. It was a disaster Rome would not forgive. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, met him upon his return not with reproach but with comfort. She financed the rebuilding of his forces, replenished his coffers, and restored his pride. Their alliance, once romantic, was now bound by necessity and survival. Still, their enemies were multiplying. Octavian, watching from Rome, seized upon Antony's failures and wove them into scandal. He claimed Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for the Egyptian queen. Rumors spread that Antony planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria and declare Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. In Alexandria, the lovers dismissed such talk with laughter, yet the laughter grew strained. The world beyond their palace was no longer dazzled by their legend. To many Romans, Cleopatra was no longer a queen, but a threat. A foreign sorceress who had ends snared their general and corrupted him with Eastern decadence. Still, for a brief, luminous moment, they ruled as gods in a mortal world, while Rome, restless and vengeful, prepared to strike. By 33 C, the illusion of peace between Antony and Octavian had shattered completely. Their alliance, once bound by the memory of Julius Caesar, crumbled under jealousy, ambition, and fear. Octavian, now the political master of Rome, moved swiftly to turn the Republic against Antony and Cleopatra. He weaponized rumor with precision, transforming their romance into scandal, their grandeur into treason. He circulated tales of Cleopatra's sorcery, claiming she had bewitched Antony with foreign magic and reduced him to her puppet. Statues of the once great general were mocked in the streets, dressed in silk and gold to resemble an Eastern desperate. Pamphlets accused him of giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children and plotting to crown himself and her as rulers of the world. Octavian presented himself as Rome's savior, promising to free the Republic from the enslavement of a queen. The Senate, hungry for an enemy to unite them, followed his lead. Antony, for his part, refused to bow. He still commanded vast armies in the east, and the loyalty of seasoned legions who had fought beside him for years. But the damage to his reputation was done. In speeches and letters, Octavian painted him as a traitor who had traded Roman virtue for Egyptian decadence. Even Antony's friends in the Senate began to withdraw, fearful of sharing his fate. Cleopatra understood propaganda as well as any Roman. She urged Antony to act decisively, to strike before Octavian could consolidate his power. But Antony hesitated, torn between two worlds. The disciplined general Rome had made him, and the god King Egypt had turned him into their love, once their greatest strength now divided him. Cleopatra's counsel was bold, but it came from the perspective of a monarch, not a statesman. She fought for dynasty. He fought for dignity in 32b. See, Octavian took the final step. He declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a master stroke. By making the Egyptian queen the enemy, he framed the conflict as one of civilization versus corruption. Rome would march not against one of its own, but against a foreign queen who had dared to seduce a Roman hero. And thus, love itself became the battlefield. The lovers would stand together knowing that to fight for one another now meant to fight against the greatest empire the world had ever known. As war loomed, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. The year was 31b. C, and the air was thick with tension and prophecy. Their combined armies were vast, hundreds of warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and enough gold to fund a decade of conflict. Yet, beneath the glitter of banners and bronze, unease lingered. The soldiers were loyal, but the cause was muddled. Were they fighting for Antony's honor or for Cleopatra's crown, for Rome or for love? Antony established his headquarters at Petri, while Cleopatra arrived with her fleet, magnificent GS adorned with purple sails and gilded prows. Her presence divided his offices. To some, she was a symbol of divine fortune. To others, a distraction that eroded Roman discipline. Commanders whispered that Antony had surrendered strategy to passion. Yet Cleopatra brought more than beauty. She brought money, provisions, and a fleet trained on the Nile, disciplined and fierce. Without her, Antony's campaign would have starved before it began. Their enemies, led by Octavian and his brilliant Admiral Agria, advanced methodically. Agrippa seized key ports along the western coast, cutting Antony's supply lines and isolating his fleet. Antony's officers urged him to fight on land where his legions held the advantage. But Cleopatra, wary of another desert disaster, insisted on a naval battle. She believed her fleet size and the favorable winds of the Ionian Sea would turn the tide. Antony, ever torn between love and logic, agreed. The lovers spent their final days before battle together in a tense stillness, half strategy, half farewell. Cleopatra tried to mask her fear behind regal poise, while Antony, weary and uncertain, sought omens that refused to favor him. The priest's readings were grim, the stars indifferent. When dawn broke over the Gulf of Actium, the sea shimmered like a mirror of fate. Antony's ships, massive but unwieldy, faced Octavian's smaller, more agile fleet. Cleopatra's flagship gleamed at the center, a beacon of gold amid the mist. On shore, thousands of soldiers watched, waiting for victory or for the end of everything they served. It was not merely a battle between two armies. It was the reckoning of two worlds. Roman order against Egyptian splendor, discipline against desire. And before the sun would set, love itself would be tested by fire and iron. On the 2nd of September, 31b. See, the dawn over the Gulf of Actium glowed red, an omen the Egyptians read with dread. Cleopatra's fleet glittered with golden prows and purple sails, while Antony's warships formed a massive semicircle across the calm sea. On the opposite side, Octavian's Admiral Agria commanded leaner, faster vessels, perfectly suited for maneuver and discipline. The world's greatest powers faced each other across the water, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. The first clash came with the roar of rams striking hulls and the hiss of flaming arrows cutting the air. Antony's ships, though powerful, were heavy and slow. Agrippa's forces danced around them like hornets, burning sails and piercing decks. The chaos grew, smoke turning the bright day into a choking twilight. Amid the den, Cleopatra's flagship waited behind Antony's line, its golden canopy trembling with the wind. Then, at the height of confusion, Cleopatra made her move. Seeing the tide turning against them, or perhaps fearing capture, she raised her sails and steered south toward open water. Whether it was panic, strategy, or prearranged escape, no one can say, but Antony, upon seeing her banner retreat, abandoned command. He leapt into a small vessel and followed her, leaving his fleet leaderless. The sight of their commander fleeing shattered the morale of his men. Roman discipline crumbled into chaos. Ships burned, crews surrendered, and the sea became a graveyard of broken oars and corpses. Agrippa's fleet surged forward, crushing what remained. By nightfall, the battle was over. Rome had triumphed. When Antony finally reached Cleopatra's ship, the two met in silence. The victory banquets of Alexandria, the music, the laughter, all seemed like relics from another life. Their empire of love had turned to ash. Cleopatra tried to console him, but Antony's eyes were hollow. He had been a soldier all his life, and he knew what defeat meant: dishonor, exile, and the slow eraser of his name from history. Together, they sailed back to Egypt under a sky devoid of stars. The sea that had once carried their triumphs now bore only ruin. Actium had not merely ended a battle. It had broken the spell that had once bound love and empire together. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Actium, their once mighty empire was a shadow of its former glory. The city that had once celebrated their splendor now trembled with uncertainty. The merchants whispered, the nobles watched, and the priests prayed, but all could feel it. Rome was coming. Still, within the marble halls of the palace, the lovers refused to yield to despair. Cleopatra filled the courts with music and incense, determined to maintain the illusion of power, even as the world collapsed around them. Antony, once the lion of Rome, was broken. He rarely appeared in public, choosing instead to train what troops remained with grim determination. He still had the loyalty of a few thousand men, but his spirit was fading. Cleopatra tried to rekindle his strength, reminding him of his victories, of his name, of his legend. But Antony knew that Octavian's shadow stretched too far to escape. In his heart, he understood that their story was nearing its end. Cleopatra, however, was not done fighting. She began secret negotiations with Octavian, sending emissaries bearing gold and promises. Her message was simple. Egypt would surrender peacefully if her children and throne were spared. She hoped to save her dynasty, even if her love could not be saved. Octavian, cold and deliberate, listened. He admired her intellect, but distrusted her motives. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a symbol, a serpent to be displayed, not reasoned with. Antony soon learned of these secret talks. Betrayal, or at least the illusion of it, cut him deeper than any sword. Rage turned to despair. Love turned to silence. The palace, once filled with laughter, now echoed only with footsteps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbor walls. Outside Alexandria, Octavian's legions marched closer, their banners glinting in the desert sun. The Nile Delta filled with the rumble of war machines and the scent of dust and iron. Cleopatra ordered her fleet burn to prevent its capture. Flames devoured the last symbol of their defiance, casting black smoke into the Egyptian sky. As night fell